gentlemen, welcome to the People's Law School. I want you to know that tonight it is my great honor and privilege to present maybe the next John Grisham in the United States of America. I want you to know that Bob Bailey, Huntsville's own, by golly, has written a book. And do you know that the book last week was chosen like the #1 legal thriller of the Beverly Hills Reading Club or something. So it's on the move, and it's great. He graduated from Davidson, the University of Alabama Law School. He's a brilliant young man. I had no idea he was writing a book, but I read it, and I'm like Leon right here, by golly, I picked it up one Saturday night, and I couldn't put it down. So I said, Bob Bailey, come talk to the People's Law School and let the rest of the people of Alabama figure out who you are and what they're missing. Bob Bailey, come right in.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that fantastic introduction, and thank you guys for having me tonight. It's certainly an honor to be here on the People's Law School. I've probably been watching the People's Law School since I was a little boy, so it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate Alan for inviting me to be here to talk about my novel, The Professor. The Professor is a legal thriller about a law professor at the University of Alabama. Played football for Coach Bryant on the 1961 National Championship team. It is entirely a fictional story, but there are some cameos by real people in the book. Coach Bryant makes a cameo, and a couple of the members of the 61 team, Leroy Jordan and the late Billy Neighbors, also make small cameos in the book. The book is a legal thriller, but it's really more than that. It's a story of redemption, and specifically Tom McMurtry's redemption. Tom is the main character of the book. He's a law professor at the University of Alabama. The book opens in Tuscaloosa at the Waysider Restaurant. Any of y'all ever eaten there? It opens with Coach Bryant asking Tom to come back and form a trial program at the University of Alabama and be an evidence professor. And Tom, of course, accepts Coach Bryant's request and comes back to Alabama. He's a young lawyer at the time and comes back to be a professor. The book then flashes forward 40 years, and you see Tom again, kind of in the twilight of his career. He's a legendary law professor, and he's got a lot of obstacles in his life that have come upon him. There's a new administration at the school. He's having some health problems. And around this same time, there's this automobile accident, this horrific accident that claims the life of a young family of one of Tom's oldest friends. Well, Tom's friend comes to see him and asks him for help, and believing his own career's over, Tom refers the case to a young student, a former student, who's just hung up a shingle in Tuscaloosa. His name is Rick Drake, and the book sort of goes back and forth between Rick's investigation of the accident and what's going on with Tom, and Tom essentially retires to his family farm in Hazel Green, Alabama, which is where I grew up, and it's right on the Alabama-Tennessee state line, and he's kind of a broken man, and the story is really about what is Tom going to do. Is he going to quit, or is he going to continue to fight? And that's why the story is so much about redemption. I've had a great time writing the book, promoting the book. We've had some great signings. We went to Nashville, Tennessee and had a signing. We had a sold-out signing here in Huntsville back in January. We were in Fairhope, Oxford, Mississippi. Been all over the place the last month. It's been a whole lot of fun, and it's really fun to be here tonight. I have to continually pinch myself about living this dream, because it truly is a dream of mine to do this. I get two questions all the time. How did you come up with the idea for The Professor, and how did you have time to write it? First question, how did I come up with the idea? I went to Alabama Law School in Tuscaloosa, graduated in '99, had a lot of great professors. Sometimes I'd daydream in class, as you do sometimes, and one of the daydreams I used to have is what would happen if one of these great professors, came back and tried a case? Could they still do it? Would the classroom cross over to the courtroom? And growing up, Alabama football fan, and SEC football so big here, in my house, you grow up, about the time you learn how to say hi, you learn how to say roll tide. And that's just the way it was for me, so don't hold it against me, Auburn folks. That's just the way it was. And so the story has some of that flavor to it. It's certainly not a football book, but there's some football flavor to it with him having played for Coach Bryant. And that kind of adds to his legendary status in the story. The other question, I guess, how did I find time to write it? I'm a practicing attorney. I work at Lanier Ford Shaver and Payne. I would get up in the mornings and right before work started. I think that's the way Grisham did it, and that's certainly the way I've done it. You have to have a really supportive wife to do that, especially when you have 3 young kids. And when the alarm goes off at 4:30 in the morning and wakes up everybody, it's never really a good thing. But Dixie's been really supportive of me, and couldn't have done it without her. The professor, like I said, is a story of redemption, and if you'll bear with me, I would like to read a small segment of the story which I think really encapsulates who Tom is. It's not a giveaway, so it's not going to ruin the story for you if you haven't read it, but it does happen in the courtroom, and Tom, as I said, has some health problems, and they sort of strike him at the worst possible moment of the trial. He's about to examine probably one of the most important witnesses in the case, and he has this crisis of health, and he's trying to figure out whether he can continue or whether he's going to have to quit and turn it over to his partner. And a lot of people have come to the trial to support him. Legendary law professor coming back and trying this case, and some of his teammates on the 61 team are there. So anyway, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read from page 376 of the professor, picking up in the middle of the page. "Miss Bolliard," Tom began, forcing himself to ignore the shooting pain. "You can't pull up lame, old man," he told himself, "not at the finish line." "On September 2nd, 2009, where were you employed?" Tom asked, looking at the jury, then to the back of the courtroom where Powell Conrad and Bocephus Haynes stood side by side behind the members of the 1961 team. Powell and Bo had left their seats so that Faith Bolliard's sons could sit down. Tom wiped his forehead and met Bo's eye, then glanced down to Billy Neighbors. Another flare of pain nearly brought Tom to his knees, but he steadied himself by grabbing the counsel table. "The Ultron gasoline plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama," Faith said. Tom nodded and cleared his throat, and another shooting pain sent his hand to his knees. "Professor McMurtry, are you all right?" Judge Cutler asked. Tom blinked several times, trying to gather himself. His legs shook, and for a minute he thought he was going to fall. Feeling a hand on his arm, he looked up and saw Rick Drake's blurry face. "Professor, do you want me to take over?" Rick asked, and the words came out contorted as if spoken through a piece of paper. Tom almost nodded. He almost said yes. Then, forcing his eyes to move, he again looked to the back of the courtroom. When he saw Neighbors, goosebumps broke out on his arm. His old teammate on the defensive line was standing, as were Leroy and the rest of the team. They were all standing, and as if the voice were speaking right to him, Tom heard words from long ago. "Men, there's going to come a day in your life when things aren't going too well. Your wife has left you or died, your house is burned down, you've lost your job, and you ain't feeling too good about nothing. When that day comes, what are you going to do? You going to quit?" Tom blinked back tears of pain as the words of the man came back to him. It had been summer workouts 1960, blistering heat that made you want to throw up, and some did. Gassers followed by push-ups, followed by more gassers. Some quit, but not Thomas Jackson McMurtry. Not then, not now, not ever. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm going to have a book signing next week at the Jones Valley location, Barnes & Noble, from 6 to 8 on Thursday, April 10th. And for the folks in Tuscaloosa, I'll be there on the A-Day game, April 19th, from 10 to 1 for a signing right outside the locker room there on the Strip. So thanks so much. It's been an honor to speak to you tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good luck, my friends. I love it.
Thank you.
To you just a little bit about myself. I had originally scheduled it like for questions and answers, but let me talk to you in the interest of time about just a few things. First of all, let me tell you, I'm Alan Brinkley, and I've been practicing law for 40 years. This is my 40th year, and I want you to know I've had a big time doing it. I grew up right here, one of 5 kids. I'm number 2, and you know when you're number 2, what that means is on your underwear, your dad puts 2 dots. My older brother Lewis was 1 dot, I'm 2 dots, Fox is 3, and Jimbo's 4. My younger sister Jane, she's the only one that got new clothes. But anyway, that's the way you are. And I mention this because I'm telling you a few things that you need to know if you're going to be a lawyer or if you're a lawyer. I tell people I grew up right here. I'm a local yokel. I'm a small town lawyer in the big city of Huntsville, and I learned everything I know in the gutters of Blossomwood. And I'll tell you, Blossomwood doesn't have any gutters, you know, but anyway, it was built before, not many. But anyway, the reason I love being a lawyer is because I remember when there wasn't a lawyer in my family, not a person who could help us. And I remember the problems, and I saw my father, I know one time walking out of an insurance office, and they probably may have even turned off the lights at my house or whatever. Times were so tough and we were so broke, and the insurance company stuck it to us, and I'm not sure whether I was the one that was driving the car or whether it was Lewis or who, but one of us, you know, it was tough times. But now, I tell you, I got too many lawyers in the family. I practice law with my nephew, Charles. His wife, Jennifer, is also a lawyer, a corporate counsel. Both my children, John and Becca, are lawyers. And Becca's married to a lawyer, Jimmy Brady. My father-in-law, Charles Crute, was a lawyer. And I want you to know, and I got one nephew, Ben, who's in law school right now in Birmingham. So we got more than we need right now, and I like it like that because it's fun. I call it the family business. I'm not quitting. I'm not leaving. I enjoy it. And I will tell you that growing up as I did around here, the point being is that, you know, I perceived myself as a trial lawyer for the last 40 years, but you really can't abandon your friends. And when you grow up in your own hometown, you got to help them. And where I grew up, over in my neighborhood, you know, about every third house there was some German rocket scientist or somebody living in it. And when all your best friends are named Heidi, Dirk, Dieter, or Klaus, right away you know there's a German influence here. And that's important. If you ever try a lawsuit in Huntsville, Alabama, you better understand the influence that we have in this town, and that is of the Germans. Now some people say, they say, well, why do you even mention that? Because believe me, you better know your jurors, you better know what they're thinking, and if that guy put the man on the moon, you better understand that he's going to know how fast the car moves, how many feet a second at 60 miles an hour. Some people say, well, let's just forget about it. These, you know, we film everything, we've got video and all this kind of thing, and so you don't even need lawyers, or you don't need jurors, or you don't need, I tell you what you need. You need to have people that sit down and can look them in the eye and make a decision as to what it is they're really talking about. And I say this because, for example, and a guy named Dan Whitsitt with Way TV one time was talking to our Sunday school class, and he mentioned this. He said, take any sentence, and let's see what this sentence means. Y'all read it with me. Any sentence. I didn't say she was the one who told me. See that sentence right there? That is, can you see it right here? Now, let me say it this way. I didn't say she was the one who told me. What does that mean? I didn't say she was the one who told me. Or, I didn't say she was the one who told me. Now, all three of the ways I said that sentence have a completely different meaning, don't they? Now, there's what's called the ore tennis rule, and that is the trial judge, when he looks them in the eye and when he makes his decision, he's making it based upon the credibility of the witnesses. That means he knows what they're really thinking and what they're saying, what's really coming from their soul. You got to understand that. It's very important. Now, we as lawyers have got to be good judge of characters, and we try to be, and also we got to have good character ourselves, I guess, but more on that later. But what do we, I'll tell you this, a lot of people don't like lawyers, and I know that. King Ferdinand of Spain, when he was sending the colonies to the West Indies, forbid that lawyers should come along for fear that lawsuits become ordinary occurrences in the New World. He forbade them. We came anyway, and in fact, we know that 24 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were lawyers. We know that 2/3 of our presidents have been lawyers. Do you know Gandhi was a lawyer? Do you know Castro was a lawyer? Do you know Saddam Hussein took his law degree at gunpoint? I understand, because he wanted one. He did. But there are so many people who have been, and listen, I tell you that lawyering is a stressful job. It is so stressful, and we've talked about that, and you've heard it alluded to. And I read a study the other day. It was very reliable and very scientific, and it said, based upon this scientific study of all of the most stressful jobs, it was determined that the most stressful job in the world is being a waitress. Lawyers are like number 8 or 9 or 10 on the list. And you know why that is? It's because we are usually in control of what we do, and unlike a person who has to wait on or serve somebody, we don't have to take their grief all the time. And even I think the reason that I do so good as a trial lawyer is because I get to get up and walk around. I don't have to like sit in church for an hour. I was an usher for years just so I could get up and walk around. And I know that's so just because I can't sit still. But, you know, it's going to be stressful to you if you don't like it. And if you don't like it, I tell you, you better go home, because lawyering, a lot of lawyers, I tell the young lawyers this, I say, you know, particularly the criminal lawyers, the first thing you got to understand is that most of the criminals, and I'm talking about the hardcore, is that the first thing the only honest person they ever met in their life is their lawyer, and the first thing they try to do is get them dirty. Now, I'm going to tell you, it happens, and I tell the young lawyers, and I say, don't be so stupid and don't be so weak. Y'all can figure out the rest of that story. But with our drugs being like they are now, and the rampant, and it's whatever, I tell you this, the first thing that a criminal will try to do is get close to you and yours. And these young lawyers, we got a fine group coming along. But as I said, you can make the difference. You can change the world. What do we do as lawyers? Let me tell you. We make big decisions. We make the very biggest decisions because we have all the details and all the facts, and they put it in our lap, and we've got to make the decisions. I don't know whether we're so smart, but we're the ones who ultimately make the decision. We're like Christopher Columbus. Remember Christopher Columbus? You know, he said, of course anybody could do it. He said, but when I did it, I was sailing off the end of the earth. Remember that. And as lawyers, what we see at the end of a case so many times is we say, oh, well, I would have made that choice. Well, no, you weren't. You were scared to death when this case first started, or when you first went to jail, or when you lost your own home, or your wife left you, or whatever it was. By golly, and you said, what do I do? Now, Mark McDaniel, who I would say is the premier criminal lawyer around town, been that way for years and decades, he says the number one decision, he said people pay him the big bucks to have him make one decision, and that is whether the defendant takes the stand. That decision is huge. And you just don't know, because if he takes the stand, you can then ask him about his 3 prior robberies or his all the kind of things. There are a lot of things that the prosecutor can wear him out on. You know, you get into a case, and next thing to know, if he gets up and says, well, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. By the way, have y'all seen like the ones where the guy confesses on TV and they play the videotape or the whatever of what he said to the newspaper reporter? Those were all setups, I will tell you right now, because that way they could get that testimony in one way or another with, let's say, the policeman or whoever was about to interview the guy, and then he doesn't ever have to take the stand so the prosecutor can't hammer him with all of the bad acts. That's why that's done. I'll tell you, Mark McDaniel says that. David Cromwell Johnston, who I think was the best trial lawyer in Alabama, no doubt about it, and if he had been alive when Siegelman was tried, Siegelman would have been acquitted, they say. Everybody says that. David Cromwell Johnston is a maniac. He's been at the People's Law School, spoke 3 times, and I often replay them because you got to see David Cromwell Johnston. He was incredible. But he said he actually got in a fist fight with one of his clients. They had this conspiracy trial, like 7 of them, businessmen charged with conspiracy, and he knew that he had the case won. He knew that this was how it was going to happen. He knew that the case could not be maintained against his client, but his client was determined that he was going to get up there and show him how smart he was and how innocent he was. And he and Cromwell got in a fight in the back of the hallway, courtroom, whatever, and he didn't let him take a stand. And did you know every one of those conspirators were convicted of conspiracy except his client? That's David Cromwell Johnston. He died at age 60 just a few years ago. But we lawyers make the big decisions. I don't know, you say, we are the captain of the ship. And you say, well, why is that so important? You can have a big judicial system like this fine courtroom we have here of Judge Rodenhauser, but if you don't have a good captain of the ship, then you are in trouble. Does anybody know what the Wassa is? I bet you do. It was the most beautiful, magnificent warship afloat. The King of Sweden in the 1700s built the Wasa. It was even inlaid with gold, had like 300 guns, 300 cannon all lined up. And on its maiden voyage, its very first trip out in the harbor, there was the King of Sweden and all the princes and the hires up there, there on the Baltic, and they all sailed out. And there was the Wasa, flags a-flying, guns a-blazing, and all this. And next thing you know, it got out a few hundred yards into the bay there and whatever, and it went bloop, disappeared. It's been gone, buried in the bay for hundreds of years. And what happened is the captain forgot to close the portholes. The wind was too strong. Bloop. That's what happened. I mention that because there was a case here called the Titanic where 13 people drowned about 20 years ago. Y'all may remember it. They went out on the SCI boat. It was a company picnic and the rains were coming.
30 years ago.
30, you're right, 1984, July. It's terrible. And what happened is, the very same thing happened. That boat, a couple of things, talking about engineering. Number one, it was 100 feet long. And if 100 foot long is supposed to be 30 feet wide, but instead it was only 20 feet wide. Number two, they closed it, and the sail factor of that boat in those terrible winds did what it did, and it all turned over, and it was an awful tragedy. Terrible, terrible, terrible. The case went on. We litigated it for 3 years. And that's another story in itself. Sometime I'll mention it. But let me tell you that like the Wasa, you've got to have a good captain. And you only need one captain. You don't need two. Who was it that said one bad general is better than two good ones? And sometimes that's really so. And in a lawsuit, it's really true. I find in the suits where I have sued the big corporations is that I pick them off one by one. There'll be 5 or 6 young lawyers in a case. And so I go to one, I find out what he knows, and he'll be telling me what the next one knows. There better be just one voice. Better be just one voice for your side, or else the plaintiff's lawyer or the other lawyer will pick you off. Now, let me tell you that we talk about decisions of lawyers and agreements of lawyers. We sound casual about the agreements that we make, but let me tell you, agreements of lawyers are by golly enforceable. Tell you a story about my friend Charlie Hooper. Charlie Hooper was my junior high school coach one time, and he was terrible. He was so mean, and he and Neil Keith gave us nothing but grief, and we still call him Coach Hooper with those. But he was the assistant prosecutor. He's dealing with a drug defendant, and he made a deal with the defense lawyer, and he said, all right, we're going to do this. I will recommend probation, and sure enough, if you turn in all of your buddies, which is what all drug people do, they turn in all their buddies, squeal like little kids and everything. And so, but later, 6 months later, when it came time for the plea, there he is to be sentenced. And so Charlie Hooper just looked at Judge Snodgrass and he said, well, I know I had an agreement, so I'll just reluctantly recommend probation. And Judge John Davis Snodgrass looked back at him and he said, well, I will just reluctantly grant it. So, oh, that was pretty cool. And I love both of them. But let me tell you, the deal's the deal. And these are enforceable. They can be oral. But we do make these decisions, and these decisions are important, and they are binding. Let me tell you about Henry Mims. Did anybody ever know Henry Mims? He was this black dude from California. He blew in here about my age. He drove a Mercedes. He was slick as he could be, and I loved him to death. But let me tell you what old Henry did. He went in, next thing you know, he is barraged with lawsuits. He's got more lawsuits than he can handle. He represents 14% of the population of Madison County, and people are just begging for him to be their lawyer and everything. He's so proud. Well, here's what I'm doing. This is around 1978. I'm standing in the courtroom of City Judge Bill Griffin, and now it's Judge Sonny Rodenhauser, but we're standing right over there. And along comes Henry. He's standing by me. We're waiting in line to get our cases heard. And he said, Brinkley, you're not going to believe what I did yesterday, what happened to me yesterday. I said, what happened, Henry? He said, well, I'm in Decatur. I represent Tommy Lee Hines. He had raped a white girl over at the railroad station. She was out in some lonely little 7-Eleven looking ticket office or something. She was all alone, and he raped her. He had an IQ of 60-something. He was very low intelligence. And the case was just unbelievably whatever. And so Henry said, he's the man. I show up, there's the Klan over there, and everybody's raising hell, and all these racists are there, and they're flying the flags and all this. He said, so I demand a change of venue, Your Honor. And the judge just looked at him, and he said, that's all right, Henry, we'll do that. He said, how about if we transfer this case to Coleman? And Henry said, hell, I didn't know about Coleman. He said, I'm from California. And so, but a deal's a deal. But if y'all know, the Tommy Lee Hines case went on for years. In fact, my law firm, we represented the civil aspect of it, suing the railroad for putting the little girl out there by herself unprotected at midnight where she got attacked. But the long and short of it, it was all about the deal that Henry made. And that was what the screw-up was. And Henry, he readily admitted it, and they brought in this team from various national groups, and Tommy Lee Hines got reasonable justice, which is what he deserved based upon his intelligence and otherwise and all that. Now Henry, I will tell you, Henry never stopped. And about 4 years later, they found Henry hanging by a rope in his garage. Remember that? Such a sad. I don't think it was connected to this case. And I miss him. And I don't believe he did it himself either. I don't know why, but he was Henry Mims. So I'll tell you about lawyers. As long as I'm talking about race things here just a minute, Lawyer Lampley, Lawyer Joe Lampley is a very good lawyer here in Huntsville, and I always call him Lawyer Lampley when he comes in, just because I thought it sounds funny. I made it up myself, you know. But I had no idea. Fred Gray was here about 5 years ago. Fred Gray was Martin Luther King's lawyer. He was 24 and Martin Luther King's 25 when they started all that trouble down in the Montgomery bus boycott case. And Fred Gray was here, and I read his book, and Fred said that when he was down there that the Montgomery lawyers some of them would insult him. They wouldn't call him Mr. Gray or Mr. whatever the other, they'd call him Lawyer Gray, because he wasn't a Mr. and he wasn't a gentleman. And I read the book, and I ran to Joe Lampley. I said, Lampley, I had no idea. I said, I hope. And you know what? He said, don't worry about it, Brinkley. I said, well, I did. I was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed about that. And but I tell you so. And I'm just ramble. I have a few more things I want to tell you. But along the racial things, and y'all know where Mayfair is. Y'all know where Thornton Avenue, Point Siena, and all those places are. Let me read you the restrictions on those houses over there that were put in 1942. Right down here. No property shall be sold to, leased to, or occupied by anyone other than a member of the Caucasian race, except in the capacity of servants. Anybody like a copy of this? This is for real. Now Goldsmith, Schiffman, Field, the deed's the same way for that one, just as bad. So, this was the law, and it was enforced. 7 years before I was born, that was written, and I'll tell you this, I'm embarrassed for it, and I'm glad that we have laws and we've got good sense and people that know what they're doing. Now, let me mention that I also had the privilege when I was in law school of working for the DeGraff and Reed law firm. The DeGraff and Reeds were the best trial lawyers down in that end of Alabama, and I worked in 1972 to 74, I worked for Mr. Ed DeGraff and Reed and Jeff DeGraff and Reed. And during that period of time, in 1966, Jeff's brother Ryan had been killed in an airplane crash, had hit the mountain over in Fort Payne. The governor's race he was to be the next governor. A governor could only serve 4 years. George Wallace was going out of power, and DeGraff and Reed would be the new governor. What happened is he got killed about a week or two before where you could enroll to be the governor candidate. And so George Wallace immediately put his wife, Lurleen, up and built the machine that was known as the Wallace machine for 20 years. I suggest to you, but for that accident, but for all of that, George Wallace would have not had the impact that he had, which was terrible for our state. But anyway, I got to work with Jeff DeGraff and Reed and Ed DeGraff and Reed. And Ed DeGraff and Reed was in his 70s, and he was so old and having dementia. In fact, we'd get him out of the nursing home, drive him over, and Jeff said, your job is to sit there and talk to him and take care of him for hours. So I would do that, and I got to do it for about 90 days, and he told me all his stories. And you wouldn't, I could just tell you, he was a great criminal lawyer and murder lawyer. He represented the mafia boss down there. And he said the mafia boss always told his girlfriend, his Molly, he said, now, if anything bad happens, you go get Mr. Ed DeGraff and Reed. So when she killed him, He was so proud of that. He said it was on a police gazette. But I read all of his files and all of these things, and I worked with him so much. But he also had been a politician, a DA and a congressman, and he lost his congressional race because he was over in Europe after World War II with the Armed Services Committee. And so he couldn't come back home. He said, Alan, stay away from politics. Politics is bad for you. He said, it's not healthy at all. He said, you stay away from that. He said, do you know? He said around there, it was like 1948 or so, he said, do you know that one week, he said, there I'm sitting in the Palace of Versailles, General Eisenhower's wife on my left, General Patton's wife on my right. There we are in the Palace of Versailles carving up Europe. He said, do you know the next week, I'm in Northport defending some kid for stealing a pint of whiskey? He said, don't ever get in politics. It's too unpredictable. Just be a normal lawyer and take care of business. So I took his advice, came home to my town, and I love it here. And the last lawyer I want to tell you about that I have to mention about is a guy named Jack Crenshaw. I had a case against a bank, First Alabama Bank, here that I filed in the 1970s. And ultimately, I got the biggest verdict there ever was in this county. And let me tell you how I did it, because nobody knows. I called a guy named Jack Crenshaw. Jack Crenshaw of Montgomery, cranky old guy, and he said, Alan, what do you need? And I said, and he was so kind to me. He gave me his whole file. This is before the internet. He said, I'll send you my pleadings, I'll send you this. And then I drove down there and read all the court papers, and there it was, this case against the Bank Trust Department. I said, well, look, this is kind of weird. This bank has really been rude to my people, the Spraggins people, and they were the biggest owners of the bank that there was at the time. Because he had gotten a multi-million-dollar verdict against him down there, and he said, you do it too. He said, let me show you the blueprint. Well, I used it. I went to the Supreme Court of Alabama 3 times, and do you know that after 9 years they paid me? But we don't ever get in a cave with a bear and hit him, you know, unless you want to. By the way, Jack Crenshaw was a brilliant lawyer. I learned in the 1960s he represented the city of Montgomery bus company against the protesters and the marchers, sitting people. That's a compliment to him. But, and I'll mention this, and I don't hesitate to do it because I don't know. I never knew the man other than what I just told you, and everybody said he was a great lawyer. In fact, I was at a bar meeting in Birmingham where all us lawyers are hanging around, and we're there at the bar, all drinking whiskey and talking about, and the guy said, well, I had a call the other day from a company out of state, and they said, well, who's the best lawyer in Montgomery? And they said, Jack Crenshaw when he's sober. So that company said, we said, well, who's the second best lawyer in Montgomery? And they said, Jack Crenshaw when he's drunk. Regarding the opening and closing of cases, I want to mention to you that when we begin with the opening of cases, is that I tell people when we first begin, this is a very important decision. The plaintiff is always very serious about the case. Defendant makes light of it. And I explain to them there, and we're usually in the circuit court with the jury. This is not a jury court, but I tell them, I say, ladies and gentlemen, you understand this is a very serious business. This is real-time courtroom. People have been sentenced to death right here where I stand. This is no joke. Now, I also tell you that you've been chosen by the government of the United States of America to make a decision, an important decision in this case. The executive branch, Governor Bentley's not going to call you and ever ask you what you think, neither the legislators, but the judicial department has called you, and the decision you make will be the law of this case. And I explained to them, I try to explain that it will be based upon the burden of proof, which in a civil case is a little bit different than a criminal case. In a criminal case, it's beyond all reasonable doubt, but in a civil case, as you know, it's the Lady of Justice. She holds the scales right there in her left hand. And it's just who's got the best case. And that's what we're going to ask you to do. And after we go through this, I explain, I say, but ladies and gentlemen, who back there is going to come in and say, after you've heard all the evidence, and say, but I'm just not absolutely sure the plaintiff has proved the case. Who's going to say that? Because that's not the burden. That's an impossible burden. That's worse than the criminal burden. All we're talking about here is money, and here you are imposing this on a person. Absolutely, you can't do it. So if you're one of the jurors back there, can each of you assure me that in fact you'll call that person to account and only require, and I will tell you that what this does is it lightens up the burden somewhat for the plaintiff. Now, at the end of the case, I remind the jurors of what they said in voir dire, and that in fact, that they agreed to hold us only to that burden of proof. And I remind them of the Lady of Justice and her scales that she holds, and I remind them also that that's in her left hand, but in her right hand, you know what she has? She has a sword. And that's the sword upon which the judgment will be executed. And that's, you have that sword now, and it's for you to make that decision. In Huntsville, Alabama, every time we conclude, and I mentioned this talking about the neighborhood earlier, is I remind every one of them that we put the man on the moon, and we can certainly protect a little old lady from New Hope from getting her car stolen from her, or whatever happened to him by the defendant. And you're the government. The experts have said what the defendant did was wrong. Common sense says what they said was wrong. But when you say it's wrong, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it will be law. And that's what I ask you to do. And that's the quick version of an opening and a closing, and if you put them together. But I'm always reminded of what this one lawyer told us at a trial lawyer's lecture. He said, I was trying to decide what to tell the jury and how complicated and all the facts. He said, but I just told him this. He said, you know, my client lost his arms in the machine, and we ask you for judgment. And he says, I had breakfast with my client this morning, and you know what I noticed about him? I said, well, he said he eats like a dog. And then he just sat down. I'm going to stop right here because let me tell you, we've got some more practical information for you coming aboard. But my son will be introducing Mr. Lee Johnston, who's going to do a fabulous job, and I look forward to hearing what he's got to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Welcome to the People's Law School. My name is John Brinkley. I'm a member of the Alabama Association for Justice, and I'm also a member of the Alabama State Bar. Specifically, I'm here today in Madison County as a member of the Huntsville-Madison County Bar. We have about 600 or 700 members here that all work to try to promote justice within our community. And within this, we have a group of people, some of you would refer to them as judges, and they're lawyers just like the rest of us. We also have assistants from our local government, albeit here in this case, Mayor Tommy Battle. He runs our city, and I'd like to say thank you to him. Judge Sonny Rodenhauser, whose courtroom we're standing in, we'd like to say thank you to him. And we'd also like to say thank you to our city council and city leaders who allow us to use this building. Some of the things that we deal with in the legal community is trying to move cases along effectively. You may have heard some of the other speakers talk to you about the backlogs and the case load that each of them carry. And I will tell you that we're fortunate here in Madison County in that we have a retired circuit judge who carries and maintains a full caseload. His name is Jim Smith, and he's also trying to move these cases along. One of the things that we're trying to do here within the state of Alabama is to move some of these judicial seats around. There are some counties that once had a greater population, albeit Jefferson County and Mobile County and Walker County, and in past several years their population has shrunk dramatically, and as a result these judicial seats that are currently in place are based on the county's population. Now, Madison County, as we know, has been growing along with Shelby County and Mobile counties, and we're all set to have another judge in our county. So what I'll encourage y'all to do is to contact your legislators and let them know how desperately Madison County needs another judicial seat. The legislators have said we're not going to fund any more judicial seats, but instead what they're going to do is they're just going to shift them around here in the state. One of the people here in Madison County that does their part in trying to keep the cases moving along more smoothly and specifically keeping our jail underpopulated is our next speaker, Lee Johnston. He is a bonding agent here in Madison County. and has also been in some of the surrounding counties as well through Action Bail Bonding Company. Lee was born in Kansas City, Missouri. He moved to Huntsville here in 1988. He came here originally as part of Intergraph as a recruiter during its booming years, and so you can see what he helped establish here with this fine technology company out here off 565. But in the last several decades, he has been a bail bonding agent here in Madison County. He's one of only 300 certified bail agents within the United States, and that's important to recognize because here in Madison County we have 20-something bondsmen or bonding companies that allow people to get out of jail. A lot of these judges, they have a criminal caseload and a civil caseload and a domestic caseload. The criminal caseload sometimes takes some time to get to court. Especially if you have a drug-related case, you could remain in jail for over a year awaiting your trial date. And that's ridiculous to some of you to understand that someone could be sitting up there, presumed innocent, without being able to see their court date. So Action Bail Bond will go in and bond them out. Now, there are many different ways that someone can get out of jail. One is if you post the full bond to reasonably assure the court. It sets these amounts of money for someone to make sure that they come back to court, and this amount is supposed to reasonably assure the court for that person to appear on their court date. These bonding agents are one method. Someone could put up a property bond. Some of you who may not want to admit you've ever had a ticket, you're also out on bond when you signed your own recognizance at the bottom of that ticket. That's an issue that we don't bring up at my house since, well, I guess we can now that my dad doesn't pay my insurance. But at one time that was a bad subject. But that's another method in which someone can be released on pretrial release. Lee Johnston is doing a fine job. Our jail is trying to always decrease its population. And Lee Johnston is going to talk to you a little bit about bail bonding and maybe some bond reform issues that we may need to hear about. And it's my pleasure to introduce Lee Johnston.
What a lot of people may not understand is that from the beginning of time, there's been crime. Whether you were living in a little village back in medieval days, or there's been crime and there's been needs to have ways to keep the people held in that community while their crimes are sent through the process. Back in the day, the Anglo-Saxon area, a lot of the laws that are in effect in the U.S. today come from our English roots in one way or another. And they would have a magistrate that would go from town to town hearing the cases and trying to put some kind of justice forth in that situation. Most of these revolved around financial situations. Somebody would steal a neighbor's cow, somebody would take a person's horse, things along those lines. So it was required for the family members of that defendant to put up some type of property equal to what was the form that person lost. Otherwise there would be blood feuds and even some things like that, you know, if you've watched the movie Braveheart, or have led to wars and things along those lines. Here in the United States, we are the only country in the world today that has a commercial bail system where you have people like myself that earn a living for their family through taking a chance on people and letting them out of bail for out of jail on a fee. What that does for you, the taxpayers, is saves about $55 a day on average of these people being kept in the facility and clothed and fed and everything else. And like John said, presumed innocent until proven guilty. A lot of people are very hard on crime, and I understand that because crime is something that we all deal with on a daily basis, and it seems to get worse every day, whether it's I had my car broken into right in my driveway, not probably 3 or 4 months ago. I really don't want that guy to get out of jail if he gets caught, but I mean, unless he has my gun, and then I may give him a hand. But one of the things that happens when you go to jail, it used to be the old, we get a free phone call to call one of our relatives, family members, friends, whoever, to help us get out of jail. Now there is a system that requires somebody to accept a collect call. The collect call is on a cell phone around $11 for 15 minutes and around $5 for 15 minutes if you have an account set up with the group that's involved playing middleman with the phone company. But that's also allowed the sheriff some types of revenue to come in to help pay and offset the citizens' taxpayer obligations to fund the jail. Right now in Alabama, there's somewhere between 600 and 800 bail bond companies in the state of Alabama. We operate on a county-by-county basis. So the only bonds I can write right now are in Madison County. So one of the things that does is that helps us get to know our customer base, I guess, is one way to put it, because they are our customers. We do believe in innocence until proven guilty. I took a survey. The phone company comes around every August to ask you if you want to re-up on your phone book ads. And so from May to August one year, I took a survey of where all my customers were coming from, because phone advertising, I don't know if anybody knows how expensive that is, but that's $2,500 to $3,000 a month for a full page ad. I would tell somebody $2,500 and they'd say, for a month, or for a year, that's good. And no, that's a month. I really appreciate the way the internet has come along, because that's saved us a lot of money in terms of advertising dollars. But one of the things that when I say I get repeat customers, many family members, just like John was talking about his insurance and his dad's glad he's not on his insurance anymore. Most families have a matriarchal or patriarchal person in their family that has some level of responsibility that everybody goes to say, hey, can you help me fix my tire? Hey, can you help me, fix the motor to my car? That's the same way our clients are, and their families are very large. And my repeat customers are the matriarch and the patriarch that are assigned to try to help these individuals through life. And I've found in the close to 20 years I've been doing this that one of the major causes of crime, I guess there's two. One is drugs. Every crime almost that you'll see, whether it's stealing, burglary, my truck, whatever, revolves around somebody with a drug problem trying to feed that habit. Secondly, we have a lot of individuals growing up without a lot of parental contribution in their life, which is really a sad incident. And them are some of the occasions that I have taken the opportunity to try to get really personal with, because these are the ones that you have a chance, a 17, 18, 19-year-old kid, you have a chance to help that person right then. Okay, I'm the first person the guy talks to after the policeman and the jail booking in officer. Okay, and by the time I've gone and talked to that child or that young man or woman, I've sat 30, 45 minutes in the office with his parents trying to understand what's going on in his life, what's happening. Well, he's met some wrong kids and is going down the wrong road or whatever. About 15 years ago, I generated a form called a condition of bond form. It's not part of my application. My application looks pretty much like a credit application. We would have an aunt, an uncle, a grandmother, a father, somebody related to that individual sign to guarantee that if he does not show up for all of his court dates, they would be responsible for the complete amount of the bond plus court costs or whatever, just like the bank. They come get the car, they put it up on the trailer, and the parent's responsible for the repossession fee, the late payment fees, the lawyer fees, everything, and that's pretty much what my application is for. Well, about 10 or 15 years ago, I generated a different form that only had about 5 or 6 bullets, and I would sit down with the parents, and we would say, what are the things we can do to help this individual get back on the right track? Okay, and we would create an individual form specifically for that individual's problem. Cannot date Mary Sue anymore, or cannot run with this crowd, or must seek help for any alcohol or drug related problems. And there's been many a time where we've left individuals in jail for 3 or 4 more days while the parents and I found a bed in a rehabilitation hospital. So we would get the child out right then, and it's do not pass go, do not go get clothes, do not eat grandma's bread pudding. You're going straight to this bed at the facility. And that seemed to work real well because they've never had anybody, a lot of times in their life, in single family homes that have given it to them like that. Usually they're in control, or they're watching video games or playing video games, and things along those natures. So I think a really important thing that the judicial system could look at, and I've made approaches to a couple of people, is if we can help these people up front, the ones that can be helped, we can save our jail space for the people that can't be helped, that have already been through the system 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and maybe put some kind of help with these younger defendants, if you will, and helping them and coaching them and how to find employment, how to get their GEDs, how to do the things that it's going to take to be successful. And that's all included in the same price. One of the things that a lot of people have seen on Dog the Bounty Hunter is there is a situation where if somebody does not appear in court, we have to retrieve them, or else we're responsible for the full amount of the bond. Okay, so we have a relationship with the court, which I will just call a signature credit card, that where I've got a chunk of money in here and I can sign my name and charge whatever I want to up to a certain limit. Okay, so we don't actually put the money up for the defendant, but it's a race. Once that guy doesn't show up for court, who gets him first? So I mean, once we get a notice that he hasn't appeared or she hasn't appeared, we have 90 days by law to find that person, or else we're responsible to the court for that full amount of the bond. And I really hate to read, but there is a law called Taylor versus Tanter that was a case before the Supreme Court that allowed for this type of system. And it's cited usually as the authority for bail bondsmen to act as bounty hunters. Was decided in 1872. And it's not clear, I don't think, whatever surety or what commercial capacity it was in. But the long and the short of it is they've picked 2 jails. They can stay in the jail they're at, or they can be released to the jail that I operate. Okay, and that jail is staying either, like we said, where we've told them to stay, and with the parent, the grandparent, wherever they're supposed to be staying. And if they decide they don't want to stay there, they get returned to custody. But that bondsman bounty hunting law was basically created in 1872, and that gives us the authority to enter a house in many occasions where a police officer would not even be able to enter the house. For example, any address on our application that the person has signed, we can go in that house. They don't like us going in there, but we can go in there. If we see somebody run into the house that we're looking for because they ran out the back door, we can go in that house. Policemen would have to wait and get a warrant, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have the need to keep a close watch on our own to make sure that they aren't abusing some of these privileges that we've been given, or else the legislature may decide they don't need us anymore either. But I've enjoyed talking to you all. I hopefully gave you a little bit of an overview of what the bail bond system is all about. And thank you, and thank you, Ms. Brinkley.
Thank you.